Invisible Hands, Manipulation, Power and the Fracturing of Perception, Episode 2, The Narcissistic Pattern, Admiration, Image, and the Quiet Erosion of Self. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Invisible Hands. If you're here after listening to Episode 1, I want to begin by acknowledging something important. That first episode wasn't light. It asked you to slow down, to listen beneath explanations, to notice moments of confusion without rushing to resolve them. For many people, that alone can be unsettling, not because anything dramatic was revealed, but because something familiar may have quietly come into focus. In Episode 1, we explored how manipulation actually works, not through force or overt control, but through patterns that subtly erode clarity, agency, and self-trust. We talked about confusion not as a failure of intelligence, but as a nervous system state. We looked at how influence often operates beneath awareness, especially in workplaces, collectives, digital spaces, and relational environments that appear reasonable, caring, or benign. We didn't name types. We didn't assign villains. We didn't diagnose. We focused on orientation. That matters because once you understand how influence works, you're better prepared to recognize when a specific pattern is present without collapsing into blame or fear. That's where we go now. General Mechanisms to a Specific Pattern. Episode 2 is the first time in this series where we narrow the lens, not to label people, but to examine one recurring relational strategy that shows up again and again across intimate relationships, workplaces, leadership cultures, online spaces, and institutions. This episode is about what's commonly referred to as the narcissistic pattern. Before we go any further, we need to say this clearly. This episode is not about diagnosing narcissism. It's not about calling people narcissists, and it's not about demonizing personality traits or mental health conditions. If you're listening in the hope of identifying who the narcissist is in your life, this episode will likely frustrate you, because the narcissistic pattern we're exploring here is not a fixed identity, it's a relational strategy, one that can be unconscious, socially rewarded, culturally reinforced, and structurally enabled. This pattern can be enacted by people who appear confident or insecure, are charming or withdrawn, are praised as leaders or admired as visionaries, or who genuinely experience themselves as misunderstood and injured. What defines the pattern is not arrogance, it's the external regulation of the self. Why this pattern matters so much, of all the patterns of influence and control, the narcissistic pattern is one of the most destabilising, not because it is always overtly harmful, but because it often feels like connection. It can feel like being seen, being chosen, being valued, and being special. And that's why it's so effective. This pattern doesn't usually begin with criticism or control. It begins with admiration, with attention, with validation, with a sense of shared identity. And over time, often slowly, often subtly, admiration becomes regulation. You don't just feel appreciated. You feel responsible for their mood, for their stability, for maintaining the image of connection. And that's where something important starts to shift. Before we go further, let's re-anchor the boundaries that protect this work. We are not here to judge character. We are not here to assign moral superiority. We are not here to turn insight into accusation. Psychological language here is not a moral judgment. Spiritual language here is not delusion. Most importantly, we're not here to label people. We're here to understand patterns that leave predictable damage. That sentence matters even more in this episode than it did in the first. The narcissistic pattern has become one of the most overused and misused concepts in modern discourse. It's thrown around online, weaponized in breakups, flattened into memes, and often used to avoid deeper reflection. This episode is not part of that culture. We're going to slow it down, we're going to strip it back, and we're going to focus on impact, not identity. Why narcissism is poorly understood in popular culture. Narcissism is often portrayed as loud, arrogant, and grandiose. Someone who loves themselves too much. Someone who demands attention and dominates the room. That does exist, but it's not the whole picture. In reality, many narcissistic strategies are driven not by excess self-love, but by fragile self-coherence. A self that cannot stabilize internally, and therefore relies on the environment and on other people to hold it together. That's why admiration matters so much. That's why the image becomes central. That's why criticism feels catastrophic. And that's why withdrawal of validation can feel like annihilation, both for the person enacting the pattern and for the person caught within it. When you understand this, the pattern becomes clearer and far less mythical. Why we're starting here? You might wonder why this is the first pattern we're examining in detail. Why not start with sociopathy, or psychopathy, or overt abuse? Because the narcissistic pattern is often the gateway. It's the pattern that looks the most normal. If there is such a thing, it is the most socially rewarded and is the hardest to recognize early. It thrives in cultures that celebrate confidence, visibility, personal branding, leadership, charisma, and image over substance. It thrives in systems that reward performance rather than presence. And because it often doesn't involve obvious cruelty, People stay far longer than they should, not because they're weak, but because nothing feels clearly wrong. Instead, something else happens. They begin to shrink. What this episode will focus on. In this episode, we'll explore what the narcissistic pattern actually is, beyond pop psychology. The core driver behind it, external regulation of self-worth, how admiration becomes leverage, how mirroring creates false intimacy, what it feels like on the receiving end, why clarity collapses in these dynamics, how language is used to maintain an image while avoiding accountability, why intelligence and empathy don't protect against this pattern, and how this strategy shows up in systems, leadership, and digital culture. We'll also continue to use the same lenses introduced in episode 1, the nervous system language as influence pattern over label impact over intent, and we'll end, as always, with observation and orientation, not resolution. A quiet warning before we begin, before we move into the first section. If you recognize parts of this pattern, either in others or in yourself, resist the urge to conclude anything quickly. This is not a morality play. It's not about good people and bad people. It's about strategies that emerge under certain conditions. Many people have enacted narcissistic strategies at points in their lives, especially under stress, shame, or threat. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. What matters is not whether the pattern exists, but whether it is examined, rewarded, or challenged. What matters for you as a listener is not whether you can identify someone, but whether you can stay connected to yourself when admiration turns into obligation. So with all of that in place, we can begin. Not with theory, not with labels, but with a simple reframe. The narcissistic pattern is not about someone loving themselves too much. It's about what happens when image replaces intimacy and when connection becomes a mirror rather than a meeting. Section 1. The narcissistic pattern begins with admiration. The narcissistic pattern does not begin with harm. It starts with recognition, with attention that feels precise and attentive, with interest that feels focused, with a sense of being seen, sometimes more clearly than you've ever felt seen before. This is one of the reasons the pattern is so difficult to identify early on. Nothing feels wrong. In fact, it often feels right, affirming, energizing, almost relieving. You may feel deeply understood, unusually appreciated, or uniquely valued. Conversations feel alive. There's an ease, a sense of alignment. Shared values appear quickly. Similar interests surface. You might even notice that they seem to reflect you to yourself, your ideas, your humor, your worldview. This is where admiration comes into play. But admiration in the narcissistic pattern is not the same as appreciation in a reciprocal relationship. It serves a different function. It regulates. At its core, the narcissistic pattern is driven by a fragile sense of self, not always obvious, not always conscious, that requires external validation to remain stable. Admiration becomes a way of holding the self together. That's why it feels intense. That's why it feels personal. That's why it can feel almost magnetic. Because what's happening isn't simply a connection, it's regulation through reflection. At this stage, the admiration is often genuine. The person enacting the pattern may truly feel energized, inspired, or even relieved by the connection. They're not necessarily deceiving. They're responding to the stabilizing effect of being mirrored. But here's the subtle shift that often goes unnoticed. The admiration is not freely given. It's structural. It establishes a dynamic where one person becomes the source of validation, and the other becomes the regulator of identity. You don't notice this immediately, because admiration feels good. It lowers defenses, it invites openness, it creates trust. Trust, when paired with intensity, accelerates attachment. This is where mirroring plays a crucial role. Mirroring isn't mimicry in the obvious sense. It's alignment, resonance, a sense that you're finally speaking the same language as someone else. Your preferences are echoed, your values affirmed, your experiences reflected with uncanny accuracy. It can feel like compatibility, and sometimes it is. But in the narcissistic pattern, mirroring often serves to collapse difference. Rather than two distinct selves meeting, a shared image begins to form. The other person's identity subtly orients around yours, or rather, around the version of you that best stabilizes them. And that's where the dynamic quietly changes, because once admiration becomes regulation, it also becomes conditional. You're valued not just for who you are, but for what you provide. Validation, affirmation, emotional steadiness, a reflection that keeps their self-image intact. At first, the conditions are invisible. They're implied, not stated. You sense them rather than hear them. You might notice that certain responses bring warmth, while others bring subtle withdrawal. Certain expressions are welcomed, while others are met with coolness or reinterpretation. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just a gradual shaping of what feels safe to be. This is where the seeds of confusion are planted. Not because you're being controlled, but because you're being guided. You start adjusting unconsciously. You lean into the version of yourself that keeps the connection smooth. You soften edges, you emphasize agreement. You hesitate before expressing a difference. And because the admiration felt so good at the beginning, these adjustments feel reasonable, even caring. After all, why disrupt something that feels so meaningful? The danger here isn't admiration itself. Admiration is a natural part of connection. The danger arises when admiration becomes the primary glue holding the relationship together, because admiration doesn't tolerate autonomy well. As soon as you stop reflecting the desired image, as soon as you express disagreement, independence, or need, tension appears. Not always openly, often subtly. A shift in tone, a hint of disappointment, persistence that does not relent, a suggestion that you've changed. And because the connection was built on intensity rather than mutual differentiation, those shifts can feel destabilizing. You don't want to lose the closeness. You don't want to be misunderstood. So you compensate, you reassure, you explain, you adapt, and slowly, without anyone declaring it, admiration turns into leverage. This is the first quiet turn in the narcissistic pattern. Not because someone decides to control, but because the dynamic has been structured around reflection rather than reciprocity. In the sections that follow, we'll explore how this admiration becomes conditional, how mirroring gives way to subtle devaluation, and why the person on the receiving end often doesn't realize what's happening until their sense of self begins to erode. But for now, it's enough to recognize this. The narcissistic pattern doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with a reflection that feels like a connection, and slowly becomes something else. From admiration to regulation, when validation becomes a need. Before we go any further into the mechanics of this pattern, I want to slow the pace again, not to retreat from clarity, but to protect it. Because there's a risk, when talking about narcissistic dynamics, that we unconsciously step into a posture of distance, that we talk about them as if we're outside the pattern looking in, as if the problem belongs only to a particular type of person, somewhere else, doing something bad. That posture might feel reassuring, but it's also inaccurate. If this episode is going to be useful, not just informative, then the lens has to turn inward as well as outward. Not in a self-punishing way, not in a confessional way, but in a way that recognizes something uncomfortable and human. These patterns don't exist because some people are monsters. They exist because certain strategies work, especially under insecurity, stress, shame, or threat, and none of us is immune to that. Admiration is regulation, not preference. At the heart of the narcissistic pattern is a specific psychological mechanism, external regulation of self-worth. This doesn't mean enjoying praise. It doesn't mean liking to be appreciated. It doesn't mean confidence or ambition. It means something more precise. It means the internal sense of self is not stable enough to regulate itself, and therefore relies on external reflection, admiration, validation, and affirmation to remain coherent. When admiration is a preference, its absence is disappointing. When admiration is regulated, its absence is threatening. That difference is subtle, but everything hinges on it. In this pattern, validation isn't just nice to have. It becomes a stabilizing input, like oxygen, like gravity, like something that keeps the internal world from collapsing. And because that regulation happens relationally, relationships take on a particular shape. People aren't just companions, they become mirrors. Why this often goes unnoticed, even by the person enacting it. It's important to say this clearly because it prevents caricature. People who rely on admiration to regulate their sense of self are often not consciously manipulative. Many genuinely experience themselves as sensitive, misunderstood, even injured. Criticism can feel devastating. Neutrality can feel like rejection. Distance can feel like abandonment. So when admiration flows, it brings relief, stability, energy, confidence. And when it wavers, something inside them destabilizes. That destabilization is often invisible to others and sometimes to themselves, but it drives behavior. Seeking reassurance, correcting perception, managing image, reasserting narrative. Not to dominate, but to restore equilibrium. That's the engine. Turning the lens inward, recognizing my own reflection. This is where I want to pause and do something deliberate. Because, as I've explored this pattern, both through study and lived experience, I've had to confront moments where elements of it weren't just something I observed in others. They showed up in me. Not in the exaggerated, caricatured way narcissism is often described online, but in subtler, quieter ways that were easier to rationalize. Moments where being admired didn't just feel good, it felt necessary. Moments where being seen, understood, or reflected brought a sense of internal steadiness, and where its absence brought discomfort that was disproportionate to the situation. And that was uncomfortable to admit, because it's much easier to talk about patterns when you're convinced you're outside them. But self-inquiry demands honesty, not innocence. A personal relationship scenario, I remember a relationship where the connection felt unusually alive early on. Conversation flowed, ideas landed easily. There was a sense of recognition, not just of interests, but of identity. Being seen felt grounding. And for a while, I told myself that was simply compatibility. But over time, I noticed something more subtle. When that reflection was present, when I felt understood, validated, aligned with, my internal state felt stable, energized, clear. When it wasn't, when attention dropped, when responses felt flatter, when enthusiasm waned, I noticed a shift in myself. Not anger, not entitlement, but a quiet unease, a pull to explain, a pull to re-establish connection, a pull to restore the reflection. At the time, I framed that as care, as want to be understood, a desire to maintain closeness, and there was truth in that. But looking back with more clarity, I can see that part of what was happening wasn't just relational desire, it was self-regulation. The relationship had become a mirror that stabilized something inside me, and when that mirror faltered, so did I. That didn't make me abusive. It didn't make me malicious. But it did mean I was vulnerable to leaning into a pattern, one where validation mattered more than I realized, and where disappointment carried more weight than it should have. That recognition mattered, because growth doesn't come from pretending you're immune. It comes from noticing where a pattern could take hold and choosing not to let it run unchecked. The invisible role shift in relationships. This is where admiration quietly turns into regulation, not through demands, not through control, but through a role shift. One person becomes the stabilizer, the mirror, the source of reassurance. The other becomes more vigilant, more explanatory, more invested in maintaining harmony. And here's the key point. This role shift is rarely agreed upon. It emerges implicitly, through tone, through response, through what brings closeness and what brings distance. And because there's no explicit contract, the person on the receiving end often doesn't recognize the shift until they're already inside it. Why this doesn't feel like manipulation. One of the reasons this pattern is so hard to identify, especially early, is that it doesn't feel like control. It feels like responsiveness. You sense that certain expressions bring warmth, others bring withdrawal, so you adapt. That adaptation feels reasonable, even relationally intelligent. But over time, adaptation becomes anticipation. You start monitoring tone, timing, phrasing, and emotional impact. Not because you're afraid, but because you want to preserve the connection. And preservation slowly replaces presence, where the line quietly gets crossed. The moment admiration becomes necessary rather than mutual, something fundamental changes. Because now, difference feels destabilizing, autonomy feels risky, and disagreement feels like a threat. Not necessarily to the relationship, but to the self. This is where conditionality begins to creep in. Not spoken, not enforced. And this is where the narcissistic pattern quietly shifts from connection into control, even if no one intends it to. Why recognizing this in yourself is not self-attack. I want to be very clear about something. Recognizing narcissistic traits or strategies in yourself does not mean you are narcissistic, you are unsafe, or you are destined to repeat harm. It means you're human. It means you've developed strategies, like everyone else, to regulate uncertainty, vulnerability, and self-worth. The danger isn't having traits. The danger is not examining them. Unexamined strategies get defended. Examined strategies get transformed. That's the difference between repetition and growth. If you're listening to this and feeling a flicker of discomfort, either because you recognize yourself or because you recognize someone else, pause. This episode is not asking you to decide anything. It's asking you to notice where admiration feels mutual and where it feels regulating, to notice when validation is shared and when it's required, to notice whether the connection expands your sense of self or quietly narrows it. Those observations don't require judgment, they require honesty. Why this section matters before moving on. We needed to start here with admiration and regulation because everything that follows builds on it. Conditional warmth, subtle devaluation, withdrawal as control. Those don't make sense unless you understand how validation became central in the first place. And they certainly don't make sense if you believe the pattern is something only other people enact. The narcissistic pattern is not a label you assign. It's a dynamic you recognize in others, in systems, and at times in yourself. That recognition is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of choice. Now that we've explored how admiration shifts into regulation and how that shift can happen quietly, relationally, even unconsciously, we can move into the next phase of the pattern. Because once validation becomes necessary, it rarely remains unconditional. Warmth begins to fluctuate, approval becomes selective, and connection subtly turns into leverage. In the next section, we'll explore conditional connection and the early stages of devaluation, not as punishment, but as an attempt to restore control when reflection falters. That's where the real erosion begins. Conditional connection and the quiet shift toward devaluation. Once admiration becomes regulation, the relationship has already changed, even if no one can yet name how. This is the point where many people later say, something shifted, but I couldn't explain what. Nothing dramatic happened, no argument, no betrayal, no clear line crossed, and yet the atmosphere subtly altered. This section is about the alteration, the moment connection becomes conditional, and warmth begins to fluctuate in ways that quietly reorganize power, not through cruelty, not through punishment, but through withdrawal. When warmth stops being reliable in a reciprocal relationship, warmth may vary, but it remains fundamentally safe. Disagreement doesn't threaten connection. Difference doesn't destabilize the bond. In the narcissistic pattern, once admiration has become regulatory, warmth starts to behave differently. It becomes responsive rather than stable. You may notice that approval feels stronger when you align, distance appears when you don't. Affirmation is present when you reflect well. Neutrality is felt as disconnection. Nothing is announced, nothing is demanded, but your nervous system notices. This is not yet devaluation in the obvious sense. It's something quieter, selective availability. Warmth is still there, just no longer guaranteed. Why withdrawal is so powerful? Withdrawal doesn't feel like aggression. It feels like a loss, and loss activates the nervous system far more effectively than confrontation. When warmth disappears without explanation, the body fills in the gap. Did I do something wrong? Did I misunderstand? Should I clarify? You search for cause, not because you're weak, but because unpredictability demands resolution. This is where intermittent reinforcement takes hold. Warmth returns, sometimes often after you reassure, adapt, or realign. The relief is immediate, the connection feels restored, and without consciously choosing it, your system learns. Alignment brings closeness. Difference brings distance. No one has to say it. Devaluation doesn't start as insult. Popular narratives often describe devaluation as overt criticism or cruelty. That can happen later. But in many narcissistic dynamics, devaluation begins far more subtly and far more plausibly. It often sounds like mild disappointment, gentle correction, concern framed as insight, or reinterpretation of your experience. For example, you seem different lately. You're reading too much into this. I thought you were more grounded than that. I don't recognize you when you react like this. These statements are not attacks. They are reframings. They reposition the issue from the relationship to you. And because the connection mattered, because admiration once stabilized the dynamic, you take them seriously. You don't get angry, you reflect. That reflection feels mature, responsible, self-aware. But over time, something shifts. Your inner reference point begins to soften. The early erosion of self-trust. One of the most damaging aspects of this phase is that it doesn't feel harmful. It feels educational. You're being invited to grow, to regulate better, to understand more deeply. And again, sometimes that invitation is sincere. But the effect matters more than the intention. If each moment of misalignment leads to subtle withdrawal, reinterpretation of your perception, or emotional coolness, your nervous system adapts. You begin to preempt discomfort by editing yourself. You monitor how you say things when you raise concerns and whether a reaction is worth it, not because you're afraid, but because you want to restore ease. This is where people often lose spontaneity. They're still present, still engaged, still caring, but something essential has narrowed. Why this feels like your fault. The most destabilizing feature of early devaluation is this: it feels earned. Because nothing overt is happening, you assume the problem must lie with you. If the warmth faded, you must have missed something. If the tone changed, you must have misunderstood. If the connection feels fragile, you must need to try harder. This is not self-criticism, it's relational logic. You're responding to patterns, but because those patterns are implicit rather than explicit, your mind turns inward. This is where confusion deepens. Not dramatic confusion, subtle confusion. The kind that makes you pause before speaking. The kind that makes you rehearse explanations internally. The kind that makes you doubt your timing, tone, or intention. You don't feel controlled. You feel uncertain. The role of image at this stage. At this point in the narcissistic pattern, image begins to matter more than truth. Not necessarily because the person intends deception, but because truth threatens stability. Disagreement destabilizes the self-image that admiration once held together, so it must be softened, reframed, or postponed. This is where you might notice conversations looping without resolution, concerns being acknowledged but not addressed, your perspective being understood but not integrated. On the surface, this looks like emotional intelligence. In practice, it creates a one-way adjustment. You change. They remain consistent or insist that they are. Why you don't leave here? This is often the phase where people later ask themselves, why didn't I leave when it first felt wrong? The answer is simple and compassionate. Because nothing felt wrong enough. There was still warmth, still connected, still moments of closeness. And because the shift was gradual, leaving would have required you to act on intuition alone, without evidence, without justification, without language. That's hard, especially for thoughtful, empathetic people. So instead of leaving, most people adapt. They shrink just enough to keep the connection intact. A crucial distinction. It's important to pause here and make a distinction that protects against moral collapse. A conditional connection does not automatically mean someone is malicious. Many people withdraw warmth unconsciously when they feel destabilized. Many people struggle to tolerate differences when their self-image is fragile. Many people use distance as a way to regain control of their internal world. That doesn't make the impact any less real, but it does keep us grounded. We are not prosecuting character. We are observing patterns, and this pattern produces a specific outcome. The outcome: you begin to disappear. By the time devaluation becomes visible, the most important change has already happened. You are no longer fully present. Not because you don't care, but because presence has become risky. You are attentive, but cautious. Engaged, but filtered. Connected, but diminished. This is the moment many people later describe as losing themselves. Not suddenly, quietly. Why this sets the stage for control. Once the connection is conditional, and self-trust has softened, power no longer needs to be asserted. It's already embedded in the dynamic. Approval matters. Withdrawal hurts. Alignment feels safer than difference. And because all of this has happened without explicit demand, it feels natural, even inevitable. This is how control operates without coercion. Now that we've traced the shift from admiration to regulation, and from regulation to conditional connection, we're ready to explore what comes next. Because devaluation rarely remains subtle forever. At some point, the tension between image and reality intensifies, and the pattern must resolve that tension somehow. In the next section, we'll explore control through withdrawal, narrative dominance, and emotional consequence, and why the most painful part of this pattern is often not what is done to you, but what you stop allowing yourself to be. That's where the fracturing of perception becomes undeniable. Section 4. What it feels like on the receiving end. Up to this point, we've examined the narcissistic pattern from the outside in. We've looked at how admiration becomes regulation, how mirroring creates intensity, how warmth shifts from stable to conditional, how withdrawal quietly reorganizes power. Now we need to move into the most important territory of all. Not the psychology of the pattern, not the motives of the person enacting it, but the lived experience of the person on the receiving end. Because if there is one reason these dynamics are so hard to name, it's this. They don't feel like abuse. They don't feel like control. They don't even feel like something wrong is happening. They feel like you are slowly becoming unsure of yourself. The early sense of being chosen. For many people, the first phase of this pattern feels unusually affirming. You feel selected, singled out, seen. There's a sense that this connection matters, that it's different from others, deeper, more aligned. You might feel intellectually met, emotionally understood, or spiritually recognized. This doesn't feel manipulative. It feels meaningful. And because that sense of being chosen often arrives after periods of disconnection, invisibility, or self-doubt, it can land with extraordinary force. It brings relief, relief from feeling unseen, relief from fragmentation, relief from carrying yourself alone. That relief matters, and it explains a great deal. Because once your nervous system associates a connection with stabilization, the stakes change. When special quietly becomes uncertain, the shift doesn't announce itself. There's no clear moment where the connection turns. Instead, you notice subtle fluctuations. The enthusiasm cools slightly. Responses take longer. Tone changes, but you can't quite say how. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. But something in you begins to watch more closely. You replay conversations. You monitor timing. You consider whether you've misjudged something. This is often the first moment where people start saying things like, I don't know why, but I feel a bit off. Maybe I'm overthinking. It's probably just me. And because nothing overt has happened, those explanations feel reasonable. You don't feel wronged. You feel uncertain, editing yourself without realizing it. One of the most telling signs that this pattern is taking hold is not what you do consciously, but what you stop doing spontaneously. You may notice that you pause before speaking, you soften reactions, you preemptively explain yourself, and you hold back questions. Not because you're afraid, but because you want to keep things smooth. You start choosing words more carefully. You consider whether a feeling is worth raising. You downplay discomfort to avoid disruption. This doesn't feel like self-erasure. It feels like maturity, like emotional intelligence, like being considerate, and that's why it's so hard to recognize. But the cost shows up elsewhere. The loss of spontaneity. Spontaneity is often the first thing to go, and almost no one notices it disappearing. You're still present, still engaged, still caring, but you're no longer free. You don't speak from impulse. You speak from calculation. You don't respond from felt truth. You respond from anticipated consequence. This is not dramatic suppression. It's subtle narrowing. And because the connection still exists, still offers warmth at times, you tell yourself it's fine. You're adapting. You're learning. You're growing. But something else is happening alongside that adaptation. Your internal reference point is weakening, doubting your tone, timing, and reactions. As warmth becomes conditional, you begin to question not just what you say, but how you say it. Was my tone off? Was that too much? Did I misjudge the moment? These questions arise quietly, internally. You don't accuse, you don't confront, you reflect. And again, reflection feels healthy. But when reflection is consistently triggered by withdrawal rather than dialogue, it stops being growth and starts being self-surveillance. You become both participant and monitor in the relationship. Confusion as the dominant experience eventually, confusion becomes the most persistent emotional state. Not confusion about facts, but confusion about reality. You may struggle to answer questions like, what actually happened? Why do I feel this way? Am I imagining this? Am I being unfair? And because you're thoughtful, empathic, and introspective, you turn inward rather than outward. You assume there must be something you're missing. This is where many people lose trust in their own perception, not because someone tells them they're wrong, but because nothing ever resolves clearly. Issues are acknowledged but not addressed. Concerns are heard but not integrated. Feelings are validated but not acted upon. Everything is named, nothing is changed, and that is profoundly destabilising. The body's experience. Vigilance without alarm somatically. This phase often looks like quiet vigilance. Not panic, not fear, just a low-level alertness. You might notice tension in the chest or jaw, shallow breathing, fatigue after interactions, and difficulty relaxing fully. Your body is bracing, not for danger, but for unpredictability. And unpredictability is harder to metabolize than threat. When a threat is clear, the nervous system mobilizes. When safety is clear, it settles. When signals are mixed, it hovers. That hovering is exhausting. Why you don't feel abused. One of the most painful realizations for people who've lived through this pattern is that they didn't feel abused while it was happening. They felt unsure, tired, muted, confused, but not harmed, which makes it incredibly difficult to justify leaving, either to yourself or to others. There's no clear story to tell, nothing dramatic to point to, just a gradual sense that you're not fully yourself anymore. And because society tends to recognize harm only when it's visible or explosive, people often invalidate their own experience. It wasn't that bad. Other people have it worse. I'm probably just sensitive. Those thoughts are not a weakness. They're a sign that harm was diffuse rather than concentrated. The shame of not being sure. Another rarely discussed aspect of this phase is shame, not the shame of being treated badly, but the shame of not knowing whether you were. You might feel embarrassed that you can't explain what's wrong, that you don't have a clear narrative, that you stayed when nothing was obviously broken. This shame often keeps people silent. They don't talk about it. They don't seek validation. They don't ask for help. Because how do you explain something that never quite happened and yet clearly did? Why empathy makes this worse, not better empathy, is often framed as protection. In reality, empathy without boundaries increases exposure to this pattern. Empathic people are more likely to consider the other person's perspective, excuse inconsistency, interpret withdrawal as pain, take responsibility for relational tension. They are less likely to assume ill intent and more likely to internalize discomfort, which means they stay longer, they try harder, they adapt more. Not because they lack strength, but because they value connection. And the narcissistic pattern feeds on that value. When you start explaining yourself more, another common marker at this stage is an increase in self-explanation. You find yourself clarifying intent, justifying feelings, adding context, not because you're being misunderstood, but because misunderstanding has become a felt threat. You want to preempt withdrawal. You want to restore alignment. You want to be seen accurately again. And each explanation reinforces the role shift. You become the one who manages understanding, the quiet grief that emerges. As this continues, a quiet grief often appears. Not grief for the relationship because it still exists, but grief for the version of yourself that felt freer inside it. You may miss your ease, your humor, your expressiveness, your certainty. But because you can't name what changed, that grief has nowhere to go. So it turns inward. Why this is so hard to describe to others. When people try to describe this experience to friends or family, they often struggle. They might say, I don't know how to explain it. It's subtle, it's just how I feel. And because the story lacks clear events, listeners may unintentionally minimize it. That can deepen isolation. Not because others don't care, but because the harm doesn't fit familiar categories. The most accurate description. If there's one sentence that captures this phase most precisely, it's this. You don't feel abused, you feel unsure of yourself. That uncertainty is the outcome. And once uncertainty becomes chronic, power has already shifted. Why naming this matters, naming the experience, rather than the pattern, is often what brings the first wave of relief. People say, that's exactly it. I thought it was just me. I didn't have words for this. This isn't about validating anger. It's about restoring self-trust. Because the most damaging effect of this pattern is not what someone else did. It's what you stop believing about yourself. Now that we've centered the receiving end experience, the confusion, vigilance, self-editing, and loss of spontaneity, we're ready to address a crucial question. Why is this pattern so hard to leave? Why do intelligent, aware, empathic people stay, even when something inside them knows something isn't right? In the next section, we'll explore why this pattern binds so effectively, looking at intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, identity entanglement, and cultural reinforcement, not to judge, but to remove shame. That's where understanding becomes liberation. Section 5. Why this pattern is so hard to leave. There is a question that almost everyone asks themselves at some point after being caught in a narcissistic pattern. It often comes late, sometimes long after the relationship, role, or dynamic has ended. And it sounds like this: if something felt wrong, why didn't I leave? That question carries weight, not curiosity, but judgment. It assumes there was a clear moment, a visible exit sign, a rational choice that should have been made. But that assumption is false. The truth is far more uncomfortable and far more compassionate. The pattern didn't trap you because you were weak. It held you because it worked. This section exists to dismantle the quiet shame that keeps people blaming themselves long after the dynamic has already done its damage, to replace moral judgment with physiological, psychological, and relational understanding. Because once you understand why leaving felt impossible, the grip of the pattern begins to loosen. Before we explore the mechanisms, we need to reframe the question itself. The question is not, why didn't I leave? The real question is, what made leaving feel more threatening than staying? That single shift changes everything, because it moves us away from character and toward context, away from self-attack and toward comprehension. People do not stay in destabilising dynamics because they lack intelligence. They stay because their nervous system has learned that connection equals regulation, and losing that connection feels like collapse. That isn't irrational, it's biological. Intermittent reinforcement, hope as a binding force. One of the most powerful mechanisms keeping people bound to narcissistic dynamics is intermittent reinforcement. This is not a psychological buzzword. It is one of the most robustly studied learning mechanisms in behavioral science. When warmth, validation, or closeness is delivered inconsistently rather than reliably, attachment deepens rather than weakens. Why? Because unpredictability heightens focus. Your system starts tracking tone, timing, mood, and availability. You don't just enjoy connection when it's present, you orient toward restoring it when it's gone. This is why people don't leave when warmth fades. They wait. They wait for the good version, the earlier connection, the relief that follows distance. And that relief is the key. In these dynamics, relief becomes more powerful than pleasure. When warmth returns after an absence, it feels intense, meaningful, and stabilizing. The nervous system learns that enduring discomfort leads to reward. Not consciously, not by choice, but through repetition. This is why people often say, it wasn't always like that. They can be amazing. When it's good, it's really good. They are not lying. They are describing a learning loop. Trauma bonding without sensationalism. The term trauma bonding is often misunderstood and frequently sensationalized. It does not require overt abuse. It does not require violence. It does not even require cruelty. Trauma bonding occurs when attachment forms under conditions of emotional threat and intermittent relief. Threat doesn't have to mean danger. It can mean loss of connection, withdrawal of warmth, destabilization of identity, or fear of abandonment. When relief follows threat, the nervous system forms a connection with survival. And once that link forms, leaving doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like a risk. This is why people often say, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't imagine leaving. The idea of ending it made me feel sick. I felt panicked when I thought about walking away. That panic isn't weakness. It's a system responding to perceived threat. Why relief feels like love. One of the cruelest tricks of this pattern is how relief masquerades as intimacy. When tension resolves and warmth returns, the emotional drop feels profound. People often mistake that intensity for depth, but what they're experiencing is not closeness. It's the nervous system regulation. Relief feels grounding, it brings clarity, it restores a sense of self. And because that restoration comes through the other person, the bond tightens. You don't just want them, you need them. That need doesn't arise because the other person is extraordinary, but because the dynamic has taught your system that stability lives there. Identity entanglement. Who am I without this? Another force keeping people bound to narcissistic dynamics is identity entanglement. Early in the pattern, the connection often becomes central to how you see yourself. You may be the one who understands them, the one who supports, the one who reflects their best self, and the one who gets it. Over time, that role becomes part of your identity. And when a relationship is identity-defining, leaving it doesn't just mean loss of connection, it means loss of self. People often say, I didn't know who I'd be without them. Everything in my life was built around that role. Leaving felt like erasing myself. This is not an exaggeration. When identity has been shaped relationally, separation threatens coherence. Staying feels painful but known. Leaving feels empty and undefined. Most nervous systems choose the known. The shame of getting it wrong, layered on top of attachment and identity, is shame. Not shame for being mistreated, but shame for having misjudged. People often carry thoughts like, I should have seen this earlier, I misread them, I trusted the wrong person. That shame makes leaving harder, because leaving would mean admitting error, confronting disappointment, dismantling a narrative that once made sense. It's often easier to keep trying than to face the grief of realizing the connection wasn't what it felt like. So people stay, not because they're blind, but because they're mourning something that hasn't fully ended yet. Fear of being misunderstood. Another powerful binding force is the fear of not being believed or understood. These dynamics rarely leave clear evidence. There are no dramatic events to point to. No obvious transgressions. No simple story. People worry. I'll sound dramatic. It will look like I'm overreacting. They'll seem reasonable. I'll seem unstable. And because the other person often maintains a coherent, socially acceptable image, the fear is justified. So people remain silent. They keep the experience inside. They carry the confusion alone. And isolation deepens attachment. Cultural reinforcement. When the pattern is rewarded, we also need to widen the lens. Because narcissistic strategies don't exist in a vacuum. They are often rewarded by culture. We celebrate confidence, charisma, certainty, visibility. We reward people who control narratives, maintain image, project authority. We pathologize sensitivity, hesitation, uncertainty. So when someone struggles in a narcissistic dynamic, they often assume the problem is their own fragility, not the relational structure. This cultural bias makes leaving feel like failure. It frames the dynamic as I wasn't strong enough. I couldn't handle them. I lacked resilience. When in reality, the pattern succeeded because it aligned perfectly with social incentives. Why intelligence doesn't protect you. One of the most damaging myths around narcissistic dynamics is this: if you were smart, you wouldn't fall into this. The opposite is often true. Intelligent people are more likely to rationalize inconsistency, generate explanations, see complexity, give the benefit of the doubt. Empathic people are more likely to consider context, tolerate ambiguity, interpret withdrawal as pain. Self-aware people are more likely to turn inward, question their reactions, assume responsibility. These qualities don't protect against the pattern. They feed it, which is why so many people feel humiliated afterwards, not just hurt. They feel betrayed by their own strengths. Why leaving often happens all at once. When people finally do leave narcissistic dynamics, it often seems sudden. From the outside, it looks abrupt. From the inside, it has been building for a long time. The nervous system can tolerate uncertainty until it can't. There comes a moment where the cost of staying outweighs the fear of leaving. The internal erosion becomes undeniable, and clarity returns through exhaustion rather than insight. People don't leave because they finally understood. They leave because their system could no longer sustain the split. That doesn't mean they were late. It means the threshold was finally crossed, restoring dignity to the experience. This is the most important thing to say clearly. You didn't stay because you were broken. You stayed because the pattern was effective. It leveraged attachment, hope, identity, empathy, and cultural reinforcement. Understanding this doesn't make you naive. It makes you informed. And information, when integrated gently, restores agency. Why this understanding matters going forward. When people understand why leaving was hard, several things change. They stop blaming themselves. They stop rewriting the past as stupidity. They regain respect for their own perception. That respect is not indulgence, it's grounding. Because without self-respect, people repeat patterns not because they want to, but because they don't trust themselves enough to leave earlier next time. Let's close this section with one final reframe, and this one matters. You didn't stay because you couldn't leave. You stayed because leaving meant losing regulation, losing identity, losing meaning, and stepping into uncertainty alone. That's not a weakness. That's a nervous system doing what it learned to do. And the moment you understand that, the pattern loses its moral power. What remains is choice. Now that we've explored why this pattern binds so effectively, emotionally, physiologically, and culturally, we're ready to widen the lens again. Because when a pattern works this well in intimate dynamics, it doesn't remain personal. It scales. In the next section, we'll explore the narcissistic pattern in systems and culture, how workplaces, leadership structures, digital platforms, and influence economies reward image over substance and regulation over reciprocity. That's where the pattern stops being private and starts shaping the world around us. Section 6. The narcissistic pattern in systems and culture, when a relational strategy becomes a social normality. Up to this point, we've stayed close to the human scale. One relationship, one nervous system, one slow erosion of self. But the narcissistic pattern does not remain confined to personal dynamics. In fact, its most enduring and damaging expressions often appear where individuality disappears into structure, where responsibility diffuses, language becomes procedural, and care is replaced by compliance. This section is about how a pattern that destabilizes people in relationships becomes normalized, rewarded, and protected in systems, not because organizations are evil, not because people inside them are malicious, but because certain strategies are efficient. And efficiency in modern systems often outranks humanity, from relational strategy to institutional logic. When we talk about narcissistic patterns in systems, we're not talking about institutions having personalities. We're talking about organizational behavior that mirrors the same core dynamics we've already explored. Image over truth, regulation over reciprocity, narrative control over dialogue, and withdrawal over accountability. In individuals, these strategies protect a fragile sense of self. In systems, they protect reputation, liability, and authority. The similarity is not accidental. Systems are designed to survive. And just like individuals under threat, they often default to strategies that preserve appearance, even at the cost of internal coherence. Image as survival. Why optics matter more than reality. Modern organizations live in public view. They are evaluated through branding, messaging, social media presence, public statements, and carefully curated values. This creates a powerful incentive. Look good, even if you're not functioning well internally. Mental health awareness campaigns are a perfect example. On the surface, they signal progress, compassion, responsibility, care. But when those campaigns exist without corresponding internal structures, they become something else entirely. They become image regulation. The organization doesn't ask, are we actually safe for vulnerable people? It asks, do we look like we care? That distinction is subtle and devastating. A lived example. When care is performed, not practiced during a period of significant ill health, I experienced this contradiction directly. At the time, I was navigating mental health challenges that were serious enough to require assessment, but not yet formally diagnosed. In the UK, this distinction matters. UK employment law is clear. An individual does not need a formal diagnosis to request reasonable adjustments. Self-disclosure of a condition under assessment is sufficient. This is not a loophole. It's a protection designed to prevent harm before a crisis. I disclosed openly, not dramatically, not adversarially. I asked for understanding, for reasonable adjustments, for flexibility during a genuinely difficult period. What followed was not overt hostility. It was something more familiar and far more corrosive. Policy as shield, not support. Rather than engaging with the spirit of the law, the organization defaulted to policy interpretation. Rules were cited selectively, procedures were emphasized, human context was sidelined. I was told, in effect, if adjustments were made for me, they'd have to be made for everyone, without a formal diagnosis. Accommodation wasn't justified, that consistency mattered more than individual circumstance. This framing sounds reasonable until you examine it closely. Equality was used to deny equity. Fairness was invoked to avoid responsibility. Policy became a shield rather than a support. And most strikingly, the law itself was quietly dismissed, reframed as optional rather than binding. Comparison as invalidation. One of the most destabilizing tactics used in systems like this is comparison. Instead of addressing the specific needs of the individual, the organization shifts the frame. What about others? Why should you be treated differently? We have to be fair. This reframing does something powerful. It delegitimizes your experience, positions your needs as excessive, and subtly casts you as unreasonable. You are no longer a person asking for support. You are a problem disrupting uniformity. This is a classic narcissistic strategy at scale. Not because anyone intends harm, but because the system prioritizes homogeneity over humanity. Occupational health without authority. Eventually, I was referred to occupational health. On paper, this looks like care. In practice, it was hollow. The therapist I met with was uncertain, hesitant, unable to make clear recommendations, not because my needs were unclear, but because the organization had not created space for meaningful accommodation. Occupational health became procedural rather than supportive. A box to tick, a report to file, a layer of distance between the system and responsibility. And as time passed, the absence of empathy, flexibility, and genuine support took its toll. Not just emotionally, but physically and psychologically. The quiet pressure toward exit. No one told me to leave. No threats were made, no ultimatums issued, but the message was unmistakable. You are not supported here. Your needs are inconvenient. Your presence is conditional. This is how constructive dismissal often works in narcissistic systems, not through expulsion, but through attrition. You are worn down, isolated, left to carry the burden alone. Eventually, staying costs more than leaving. And when you leave, the system remains intact, untouched, unchallenged, unchanged. The hypocrisy that cuts deepest. What made this experience particularly painful was not just the lack of support. It was the public contradiction. This same organization regularly promoted its commitment to mental health. Annual LinkedIn posts, awareness campaigns, performative statements during Mental Health Awareness Month. To see those messages while knowing the lived reality was profoundly unsettling. It created a fracture between narrative and truth. And that fracture is one of the most damaging aspects of institutional narcissism, because when care is publicly proclaimed but privately denied, it doesn't just harm individuals, it destroys trust. Why this isn't about one company. It's important to say this clearly. This is not a story about a single workplace, it's a pattern. Across industries, people report the same dynamics. Well-being language without infrastructure, legal protections minimized or misunderstood, vulnerability framed as inconvenience, image preserved at the expense of people. These systems are not broken, they are functioning exactly as designed. Why narcissistic strategies thrive in institutions reward certainty, compliance, risk aversion, narrative coherence. They punish complexity, vulnerability, ambiguity, disruption. Narcissistic strategies, image management, withdrawal, selective empathy fit this environment perfectly. They reduce liability, maintain control, and preserve authority, which is why they persist. The cost to individuals. For individuals inside these systems, the impact is profound. You don't just lose a job, you lose a sense of dignity. You begin to question whether your needs were legitimate, whether you asked for too much, whether you misunderstood your own experience. This is epistemic erosion at scale. The system doesn't just deny support, it undermines your trust in your own perception. The cost to collectives, but the damage doesn't stop with individuals. When systems operate this way, collectives suffer too. Creativity declines, engagement drops, burnout increases, cynicism spreads. People learn not to disclose, not to trust, not to expect care. Mental health becomes a slogan, not a practice. And the system slowly hollows out from the inside. Compassion without excusing harm. It's essential to hold nuance here. Many people inside these systems are not cruel. They may be constrained, fearful, or misinformed. They may believe they are following the procedure correctly. But impact still matters. Understanding why a system behaves this way does not absolve it of responsibility. Empathy does not require silence. And compassion does not mean compliance. Why these systems feel normal. One of the most dangerous aspects of institutional narcissism is how normal it feels. People say, that's just how it works. You can't expect organizations to care. Everyone has to deal with it. This normalization is itself a form of gaslighting. It trains people to accept harm as inevitable and to blame themselves when they struggle. The nervous system in narcissistic systems. At scale, these environments produce the same nervous system effects we saw in relationships: chronic vigilance, emotional flattening, withdrawal, disengagement masked as professionalism. People don't rebel, they shut down, and systems mistake that shutdown for resilience. Why leaving feels like failure. When people leave these environments, they often feel ashamed. Not relieved, ashamed. They feel weak, unsuccessful, unable to cope. But leaving a system that refuses to meet basic human needs is not failure. It's self-preservation, and the fact that it feels like failure tells us everything we need to know about the system's values. Bringing it back to the pattern, the narcissistic pattern in systems looks like this. Care is proclaimed, not practiced. Vulnerability is encouraged, then punished. Policy replaces empathy. Image replaces relationship. Withdrawal replaces accountability. This is not accidental, it is adaptive for the system, and destructive for the human beings within it. Why naming this matters. When people hear their experiences reflected accurately, without exaggeration or blame, something shifts. They stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what kind of system was I in? That shift restores agency, not through anger, through clarity. Now that we've seen how the narcissistic pattern scales into systems and culture, we're ready to return to the body. Because whether the pattern appears in a relationship or an institution, the nervous system responds in the same way. In the next section, we'll explore the nervous system lens, why clarity collapses under narcissistic dynamics, why approval becomes safety, and why withdrawal triggers threat responses. That's where understanding turns into integration. Section 7. The nervous system lens, why clarity collapses around narcissistic dynamics. Up to this point, we've explored the narcissistic pattern as a psychological and relational structure, how it forms, how it binds, how it scales into systems and culture. But there is still a crucial layer missing if this work is going to land where it matters most. Because people don't stay confused, bonded, or stuck because they don't understand enough. They stay because their nervous system has shifted state. This section brings us fully into the body-knows lens, not as metaphor, not as self-help language, but as a grounding framework that explains why clarity collapses, why logic fails, and why insight alone does not free people from these dynamics. Before psychology, there is the state. One of the most damaging myths about narcissistic dynamics is that people remain trapped because they are naive, emotionally dependent, or lacking boundaries. In reality, most people do sense that something is wrong, but sensing is not the same as acting. Because when the nervous system enters a threat-adapted state, the brain does not operate the way we assume it does. Reasoning narrows, perception prioritizes safety, Ambiguity becomes intolerable. This is not a weakness. It is biology, threat versus safety, the binary beneath the pattern. At the most fundamental level, the nervous system is not interested in truth, fairness, or self-actualization. It is interested in one thing. Am I safe? Under stable conditions, safety allows for curiosity, differentiation, disagreement, reflection, choice. Under threat, the system collapses into a binary operation. Approach or withdraw, appease or defend, stay connected or lose regulation. Narcissistic dynamics exploit this shift, not necessarily consciously, but structurally. Because when approval becomes intermittent and withdrawal unpredictable, the body reads relational instability as threat. And once threat is perceived, clarity is no longer the priority. Survival is. Why approval starts to feel like safety. In healthy relationships, approval is pleasant but optional. In narcissistic dynamics, approval becomes regulatory. Why? Because when warmth is inconsistent, its return produces relief. And relief is one of the strongest safety signals the nervous system can experience. Over time, the body learns. Approval equals safety, withdrawal equals threat. This learning is implicit, not intellectual. You don't decide it. Your system absorbs it. And once approval becomes safety, the cost of losing it feels catastrophic, even if logically you know you would survive. Freeze and fawn, the hidden survival responses. When people talk about threat responses, they usually focus on fight or flight. But narcissistic dynamics rarely trigger those. They trigger freeze and fawn. Freeze, hesitation, cognitive fog, paralysis, difficulty making decisions, feeling stuck. Fawn, appeasing, over-explaining, prioritizing harmony, self-silencing, taking responsibility for relational tension. These are not personality traits. They are contextual survival strategies. They emerge when threat is relational, power is asymmetrical, escape feels risky, and confrontation feels unsafe. This makes narcissistic dynamics a perfect breeding ground for them. While logic fails under coercive bonding, many people later say, I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't think clearly. It's like my intelligence switched off. I couldn't trust my own judgment. This isn't because intelligence disappeared. It's because the nervous system deprioritized higher cognition. Under threat, the brain reallocates resources away from abstract reasoning, long-term planning, complex moral evaluation, toward monitoring cues, anticipating withdrawal, restoring equilibrium. You don't lose intelligence. You lose access to it, which is why insight often arrives after the threat subsides, not during. Mixed signals, the most destabilising state, one of the most toxic features of narcissistic dynamics, is not cruelty, it's inconsistency, warmth and withdrawal, validation and correction, closeness and distance. The nervous system cannot resolve mixed signals. Clear threat mobilizes, clear safety settles, but ambiguity creates chronic vigilance. You are never fully relaxed, never fully alarmed, always monitoring. This state drains energy, clarity, and agency over time, and because it doesn't feel dramatic, people often normalize it. This is just stress. I'm just tired. I need to work on myself. Meanwhile, the body is quietly signaling overload, why confusion is a physiological state. One of the most important reframes in this entire series is this. Confusion is not a failure of intelligence, it is a state shift. When people are repeatedly exposed to reality erosion, conditional validation, narrative dominance, and withdrawal-based control, their nervous system adapts by reducing certainty. Why? Because certainty increases risk. If you are certain, you might confront. If you confront, you might lose connection. If you lose connection, you lose regulation. So the body does something ingenious and tragic. It softens certainty. It introduces doubt. It keeps you hovering. Confusion becomes protective. Why the body holds what the mind can't resolve. Many people report physical symptoms in these dynamics. Tension, fatigue, digestive issues, headaches, dissociation, shutdown. These are not coincidences. When relational threat cannot be resolved through action, the body carries it instead. The nervous system holds unfinished survival responses. And without resolution, those responses become chronic. This is why people often feel relief only after leaving, even if the emotional fallout is intense. The threat has ended. The body can finally exhale. Systems and the nervous system. This same dynamic scales into workplaces, institutions, and cultures. When dissent is subtly punished, vulnerability is rhetorically encouraged but practically unsafe. Approval determines access. People don't revolt. They freeze, they fawn, they disengage. And organizations mistake that for professionalism. This is how narcissistic systems remain stable while hollowing people out. Why just set boundaries is inadequate advice. One of the most common pieces of advice given to people in narcissistic dynamics is just set boundaries. But boundaries require clarity, safety, self-trust, tolerance for loss, all of which are compromised when the nervous system is in threat state. Asking someone to set boundaries without restoring safety is like asking someone to swim while holding them underwater. It misunderstands the problem. The issue is not lack of will, it's a lack of regulation. Recovery begins with state, not insight. This is why recovery from narcissistic dynamics cannot start with analysis alone. Insight helps, language helps, understanding helps, but regulation comes first, before asking, what happened? Why did they do that? How do I prevent this again? The more important questions are, what state am I in? What does my body need to feel safe again? Where did I abandon myself to preserve connection? Without restoring internal safety, people repeat patterns, not because they don't know better, but because their nervous system is still calibrated to threat. Let's name this clearly. You didn't crave the person. You didn't crave the system. You didn't crave the approval. Your body craved the relief of regulation. Once you understand that, shame begins to dissolve, because you weren't weak, you were adapting. Why this matters for the rest of the series, this nervous system lens is not an add-on, it is the foundation. Without it, psychology becomes moralized, patterns become personal failures, recovery becomes self-improvement theater. With it, behavior becomes contextual, harm becomes understandable, and healing becomes relational and embodied. In the next sections, we'll explore how language interfaces with the nervous system, how certain phrases, tones, and narratives bypass cognition and directly regulate behavior. But everything that comes next rests on this understanding. You cannot think your way out of a state your body is still living in. Once you honor that, the path forward stops being about fixing yourself and starts being about coming home to yourself. That's where real orientation begins. Section 8, language patterns unique to the narcissistic strategy. If Section 7 explained why clarity collapses, this section explains how. Because once the nervous system is oriented towards safety seeking, language becomes the most efficient tool of influence. Not dramatic language, not aggressive language, but language that sounds reasonable, feels caring, and appears cooperative, while quietly collapsing choice. This is where many people lose the thread. They can sense something is off, but they can't point to a single sentence and say, that was manipulation. That's because the language isn't designed to persuade the mind. It's designed to regulate the body. This section brings us fully into the linguiverse. Language not as meaning, but as signal. Language as regulation, not communication. Most people assume language exists to exchange information, but in relational power dynamics, language often serves a different function. It regulates emotional states and behavioral boundaries. In narcissistic strategies, language is used to stabilize self-image, manage threat, maintain narrative control, and quietly direct the other person's response. The content may be benign, the effect is constricting. This is why people often say, they didn't say anything wrong. It was the tone. I felt shut down, but I don't know why. That why lives below conscious interpretation. Tone over content. The primary signal in the linguiverse framework, tone carries more regulatory power than words. Tone tells the nervous system whether it is safe to speak, whether disagreement is welcome, whether autonomy is permitted. Narcissistic language patterns rely heavily on calmness without openness, softness without receptivity, reassurance without responsiveness. The tone is steady, controlled, reasonable. This makes it very difficult to challenge. If you push back, you appear emotional. If you question it, you appear reactive. If you withdraw, you appear avoidant. The tone has already positioned you. Plausible deniability, embedded in language A. Defining feature of narcissistic language is plausible deniability. The phrases are constructed so that intent cannot be questioned, harm cannot be named, accountability cannot be pinned. For example, I'm only saying this because I care. On the surface, this is benevolent. At a nervous system level, it does something else. It frames disagreement as ingratitude, resistance as immaturity, autonomy as rejection of care. If you object, you're no longer responding to content, you're responding to character framing. This is not overt control, it's context control. Moralized self-image language. Another core pattern is language that protects self-image through moral framing. Examples include, I value honesty. I just want what's best. I have strong principles. I don't tolerate disrespect. These statements are not inherently problematic, but in narcissistic strategies, they function as preemptive shields. Once someone has positioned themselves as ethical, principled, or emotionally evolved, any challenge can be reframed as misunderstanding, threat, or moral failure. The conversation becomes asymmetric. You are responding upward to an identity claim rather than laterally to a point of discussion. Victim framing without vulnerability. Narcissistic language often includes subtle victim framing without the openness that true vulnerability requires. Examples, people usually misunderstand me. I've always had to be strong. I give more than I receive. These statements do three things at once. 1. They solicit empathy. 2. They preempt accountability. 3. They position the speaker as uniquely burdened. If you raise a concern after this framing, you risk appearing insensitive. So you soften, reassure, you delay. The language has already done its work. Dismissal disguised as concern. One of the most destabilizing linguistic moves in narcissistic dynamics is dismissal framed as care. Examples: you're overthinking. You're taking this too personally. You're stressed. That's why it feels like this. Again, these are not always manipulative, but in a pattern where power is already asymmetrical, they function to relocate authority from your perception to theirs, recast your experience as distortion, and close down further inquiry. You're not told you're wrong. You're told you're affected, and that's much harder to contest. Questions that remove agency. Another common strategy is the use of leading questions that sound collaborative but narrow choice. For example, don't you think it would be better if? Wouldn't you agree that? Can you see how this might be unfair? These questions don't open dialogue. They guide agreement. If you disagree, you're not answering a question, you're challenging the premise of reasonableness itself, which makes dissent feel risky. This is just how I am. Identity-anchored language is another key feature. Phrases like, that's just who I am. I've always been like this. I don't change for anyone. These statements freeze the dynamic. They remove responsibility, block negotiation, and frame adaptation as betrayal. Your options narrow too: accept, accommodate, or withdraw. Dialogue is no longer possible, only compliance or loss. Why these patterns feel invisible? What makes these linguistic strategies so effective is that none of them require deception. The speaker may genuinely believe what they're saying. The harm arises not from falsity, but from asymmetry. When one person's language consistently sets the frame, defines reasonableness, interprets reality, and closes alternatives, the other person adapts, often without realizing it. Language becomes a behavioral regulator. The nervous system translation. From a nervous system perspective, these patterns do something very specific. They reduce perceived options, increase uncertainty around speaking, and tie safety to agreement. The body responds by softening expression, delaying response, and prioritizing harmony. This is why people often say, I didn't feel silenced, I just stopped talking. Silence wasn't imposed. It was selected by the nervous system. While you can't argue your way out, many people try to counter these dynamics with logic. They explain, they clarify, they present evidence. But this misunderstands the level at which the influence is operating. You're responding to content. The pattern is operating through signal. Until the nervous system feels safe to disagree, no amount of reasoning will restore agency. This is why conversations loop. Why resolution never arrives. Why understanding doesn't lead to change. Linguistic ambiguity is control. Another feature worth naming is strategic ambiguity. Statements that are vague, open-ended, or incomplete. For example, I don't know if this is the right time. We'll see. Let's not rush. Ambiguity keeps you waiting. Waiting keeps you oriented toward approval. Clarity would require commitment, and commitment would require vulnerability. So ambiguity preserves control. When language replaces presence in healthy relationships, language supports presence. In narcissistic dynamics, language replaces it. Words stand in for accountability, repair, mutuality. You get explanations instead of change. Reassurance instead of responsiveness. Narrative instead of repair. And because the words sound reasonable, the absence of action becomes harder to name. The core linguaverse insight. Here is the central linguaverse translation for this section. Language can feel safe while signaling threat, not because the words are harsh, but because they limit response, redirect perception, and regulate behavior. Once you see this, many past interactions suddenly make sense. Not because you reinterpret them negatively, but because you finally understand why your body responded the way it did. What this section is not asking you to do, before we move toward observation practice, it's important to say what this section is not asking. It is not asking you to monitor speech obsessively, analyze every sentence, confront people over phrasing, or diagnose intent. That would recreate vigilance, not restore agency. Instead, this section is offering orientation, a way to understand how language shaped your state, so you can stop blaming yourself for responding the way you did. If you find yourself thinking, how did I not notice this? Why didn't I push back? Why did I doubt myself? Pause. You were responding to signals, not arguments. And your body did exactly what it was designed to do under those conditions. Now that we've explored how language operates beneath meaning, regulating behavior, shaping perception, and narrowing choice, we're ready to step out of analysis. The next section will not teach techniques. It will not offer fixes. It will not ask you to confront anyone. Instead, it will offer a simple observation practice, a way to notice signals before you make meaning of them, not to catch anyone out, but to stop disappearing inside yourself. That's where orientation begins to return. Section 9, Observation Practice, the signal before meaning. Up to this point, this episode has done a lot of naming. We've named patterns, we've named dynamics, we've named how psychology, systems, language, and the nervous system interact. Now we deliberately step out of explanation. Not because explanation is wrong, but because explanation alone does not restore orientation. This section is not a technique. It is not an exercise. It is not a method you need to do correctly. It is an invitation to notice without interpretation, agenda, or outcome, and that distinction matters more than it might seem. Why observation comes before meaning. Most people believe that understanding leads to freedom. In relational power dynamics, the opposite is often true. Freedom begins when you stop forcing meaning onto what your body already knows. When people are caught in narcissistic patterns, they tend to overthink what something meant, why it happened, who was at fault, what they should have done. This keeps the nervous system active, searching, evaluating, replaying. Observation does something different. It interrupts the search. It brings attention back to signal, not story. Signal before meaning, before every interpretation. There is a signal. Before you decide, that was manipulative, I'm overreacting, they didn't mean it, your body has already responded. A contraction, a hesitation, a tightening, a pause. These signals occur before language, before narrative, before judgment. And they are reliable, not because they tell you the truth of a situation, but because they tell you the state change inside you. This practice is about learning to notice that moment. What this practice is not. Before we go any further, it's important to be explicit. This practice is not about diagnosing narcissism, spotting manipulation, analyzing others' motives, or preparing confrontation. It is also not about fixing yourself, regulating perfectly, or becoming hyper-aware. Hyper-awareness is just vigilance in a different costume. This practice is about gentle noticing and stopping there. Practice. Over the next few days, or simply as you listen, notice moments when your body contracts, your speech shortens, you hesitate before responding, you feel a pull to explain, and you second-guess a perception. That's it. No labeling, no deciding why, no judging whether it's justified. Just notice that it happened. Why just notice is harder than it sounds. Most people struggle with this practice, not because it's complex, but because it goes against conditioning. We are trained to interpret immediately, justify responses, rationalize discomfort, explain feelings away. Noticing without interpretation can feel unsafe. Your mind will want to jump in. This is silly. I already know this. What does this even mean? That's fine. You don't need to stop those thoughts. Just don't follow them. Return to the signal. The subtle power of non-action in narcissistic dynamics. Power is maintained through reaction. You react by explaining, softening, reassuring, accommodating, or withdrawing. Observation interrupts that loop, not by opposing it, but by pausing it. Pausing doesn't mean freezing. It means not rushing to restore equilibrium. For many people, this is the first time they experience what it's like to let discomfort exist without immediately resolving it. That alone is a shift. What you might notice first, people often expect dramatic sensations. In reality, what you'll likely notice is mundane. A subtle drop in energy, a moment of mental blankness, a slight change in posture, a feeling of I don't know what to say. These are not signs of weakness. They are micro state changes, and they matter, because these micro shifts are where autonomy quietly disappears or begins to return. The difference between observation and monitoring. There is an important distinction here. Observation is open. Monitoring is anxious. Monitoring asks, what does this mean? Is this bad? Should I do something? Observation asks nothing. It simply registers. If you notice yourself becoming tense about noticing, that's a sign you've slipped into monitoring. No problem. Just soften your attention again. Why this practice restores agency. Agency does not come from control. It comes from self-trust. And self-trust begins when you allow your body's signals to exist without invalidating them. In narcissistic dynamics, people learn to override first responses in order to preserve connection. This practice gently reverses that conditioning, not by asserting boundaries, but by stopping the override. You are not required to act on what you notice. You are required only to not erase it. When nothing happens, some people will listen to this and say, I don't notice anything. I feel fine. Nothing stands out. That's okay. This is not a test. Often, numbness is itself a signal, but we don't force that recognition. If nothing appears, we trust that. Observation respects timing. When a lot happens, others will notice a flood. Memories, sensations, tears, anger, relief. If that happens, slow down. This practice is not about excavation. It's about orientation. If things intensify, return to something concrete. Your breath, your feet, the room you're in. Presence before processing. Why we don't interpret yet. You may be tempted to connect what you notice to specific people, past events, or conclusions. We deliberately do not do that here. Interpretation comes later, if at all. For now, we're simply rebuilding a relationship with signal. That relationship was interrupted by patterns that taught you to doubt, to minimize, to explain away. This practice reintroduces a different possibility. If you find yourself thinking, I should have trusted this before, why didn't I listen to myself? Pause. Your system adapted to survive. Trust returns after safety, not before. This practice is not about correcting the past. It's about creating conditions for a different future. What changes when you keep noticing over time without effort? A few things to shift. You pause more naturally. You feel less compelled to explain. You notice when warmth feels conditional. You sense when approval begins to regulate you, not with alarm, with clarity. And clarity does not require action to be real. Why this is enough for now, many frameworks rush people toward empowerment. They say, speak up, set boundaries, or call it out. Those things may come, but they are not prerequisites for sovereignty. Sovereignty begins when you stop abandoning your internal signal. This practice is about staying with yourself. Preparing for integration, in the next section, we will not introduce new material. We will settle. We will debunk one final myth. For now, let this practice be light. You don't need to remember it. You don't need to repeat it. Just let it be available. If you take nothing else from this practice, take this. You are not broken because you adapted. You are not weak because you paused. You are not naive because you trusted. Your body learned how to survive. Observation is how it learns something new. Orientation, not resolution. Restoring internal reference, not creating certainty. We've reached the end of this episode, but not the end of the work it gestures toward. That distinction matters. Because if there is one thing this entire exploration of the narcissistic pattern has tried to do, it is this, to interrupt the urge for premature clarity. Not everything that harms us announces itself clearly. Not everything that binds us feels dramatic. Not everything that erodes us looks like abuse. And not everything that frees us comes from understanding alone. This closing section is not designed to give you answers. It is designed to give you orientation. What this episode was never trying to do. Before we integrate, it's important to name what this episode was not doing, because misinterpretation is one of the risks of material like this. This episode was not an invitation to label people in your life, retroactively diagnose relationships, reframe every difficulty as narcissistic harm, or view yourself as perpetually vulnerable. That path leads to paranoia, not agency. Instead, this episode has been about pattern literacy, learning to recognize recurring relational structures without collapsing into blame, fear, or moral judgment. Patterns are not accusations. Patterns are maps, and maps are meant to orient, not alarm. Core insight. If we distill the entire episode down to one essential insight, it is this. The narcissistic pattern is not defined by confidence or superiority. It is organized around fragility. Fragility of self-concept, fragility of image, fragility of regulation. What appears as dominance is often compensation. What appears as certainty is often defense. What appears as control is often fear of collapse. This does not excuse harm, but it does prevent us from replacing understanding with mythology. Debunking the final myth. Let's explicitly dismantle one of the most persistent myths surrounding narcissism, because it quietly fuels shame on both sides of the dynamic. Myth. If someone is narcissistic, they must be confident, secure, and self-assured. Reality. The narcissistic pattern is built around instability, not strength. Image replaces coherence. Validation replaces self-regulation. Control replaces connection. And because image is easier to maintain than integrity, the pattern can look powerful while being fundamentally brittle. Understanding this matters, not so you excuse behavior, but so you stop internalizing it, bringing it back to you without making you the problem. Throughout this episode, we've moved across several layers: relational dynamics, emotional experience, nervous system responses, language patterns, systems, and culture. But the through line has always been the same. Where did you begin to disappear in order to preserve connection? Not because you were weak, not because you lacked insight, but because your system learned that safety lived outside of you. The work now is not to harden yourself. It's not to become hypervigilant. It's not to close off from intimacy. It's to restore internal reference. Internal reference. What was actually lost, many people think they lost themselves in narcissistic dynamics. What they actually lost was something more specific. They lost trust in first responses, confidence in perception, permission to prioritize internal signals. This didn't happen all at once. It happened through adaptation, accommodation, empathy, and hope, which is why recovery doesn't come from force. It comes from realignment. Why we don't end with advice. You may notice something intentional about this episode. We have not ended with boundary checklists, red flag inventories, scripts for confrontation, or strategies for winning interactions. That's not an oversight. Advice without regulation becomes pressure. Pressure recreates the very state that made these dynamics binding in the first place. Instead, what we're doing here is slowing the system down, yours. Orientation before action, signal before meaning, presence before decision. What integration actually means here, integration does not mean everything makes sense now, the past is resolved, or future harm is impossible. Integration means something quieter. It means you no longer dismiss your internal responses, you no longer override contraction reflexively, you no longer mistake confusion for failure. Integration is when you stop arguing with your body. A subtle but crucial shift. If this episode has landed, you may notice a subtle change, not in your thinking, but in your posture. You might Pause more easily, feel less compelled to explain, tolerate ambiguity without self-attack. Notice when approval starts to feel regulating. These are not signs of detachment. They are signs of reclaiming agency. The difference between sovereignty and defensiveness. It's worth naming this distinction explicitly because it's often misunderstood. Sovereignty is not withdrawal. Sovereignty is not suspicion. Sovereignty is not emotional armor. Sovereignty is the capacity to remain internally anchored while relating. It's the difference between choosing connection and needing it to stabilize you. That difference is subtle and life-changing. Before we close, I want to offer one final reframe, not as a takeaway, but as an orientation you can return to. You did not stay because you were blind. You did not stay because you were broken. You did not stay because you lacked strength. You stayed because your nervous system adapted, your empathy engaged, your identity entangled, and your hope persisted. That combination is not a flaw, it is human. The task now is not to undo your humanity, but to house it more safely. This episode has focused on a pattern that revolves around validation, image, and relational regulation. The next episode shifts the terrain. In episode 3, Sociopathy, Psychopathy, and Power, we will move away from validation seeking and into a different landscape altogether, where charm replaces mutuality, detachment replaces confusion, and power is exercised without the need for your reflection. This matters because many people conflate these patterns, and doing so blurs important distinctions. The next episode will explore instrumental dominance, consequence-blind behavior, and the absence of relational reciprocity. Not to sensationalize, not to demonize, but to clarify, because clarity, when grounded, is protective. As we close this episode, I invite you to hold one thing gently, not as a belief, but as a question you don't need to answer yet. Where do I shrink in order to keep connection, and what would happen if I didn't? No action required, no response needed, no conclusion demanded. Just let the question exist. This episode wasn't about spotting narcissists. It was about recognizing the moments you disappear and choosing, slowly and kindly, not to. Until next time, stay oriented, stay embodied, and stay in dialogue with yourself. You've been listening to Invisible Hands Manipulation, Power, and the Fracturing Perception. I'm James Miller.